how I can run my Azure function, and what is all trigger type that can make my Azure function run. I'm going to explain all the type that we can find for trigger an Azure function and how I can bind my Azure function with my data.
Triggers are what causes a function to run. A trigger defines how a function is invoked, and a function must have exactly one trigger. This trigger have associated data, which is often provided as the payload of the function. To make a run an Azure function, we have many triggers, like a Blob storage, a queue storage, a service bus, an event hub, a timer, a webhook, an event grid, and a Cosmos DB trigger. So let's go and explain each trigger and how it works. Timer trigger is called on a predefinite schedule. We can set the time for the execution of the Azure function using this trigger. A blob trigger that will get fired when a new update blob is detected. The blob content are passed on as input of the function. An event hub trigger is used for the application instrumentation, user experience, a workflow processing, and even the Internet of Things. This trigger will get fired when any event are delivered to the Azure Event Hub. A HTTP trigger get fired when a HTTP request comes. Queue trigger get fired when any message come in Azure Storage queue. A generic webhook, this trigger get fired when a webhook HTTP request come from any service that support webhook. A GitHub webhook, this trigger is fired when event occurred in your GitHub repository. This GitHub repository support events such as a branch created, delete the branch, issue command, and commit command. A service bus trigger is fired when a new message comes from a service bus queue or topic. A binding is a connection to the data within a function. Bindings are optional and come in from the input and the output binding. The input binding is the data that your function receives, and the output binding is the data that your function sends. Binding to a function is a way to connect another external source to our function. Binding may be connected as an input binding or an output binding, or both. Data from the binding is provided to the function as a parameter. You can mix and match different binding to suit your needs. All trigger and binding have a direction. That is a property that is defined in the function.json file. That we describe the direction, that is the always in, the input and the output binding, and some bindings support a special direction in-out if you use the in-out only. When you use an attribute in the class library to configure the trigger and the binding, the direction is provided in the attribute constructor or inferred from the parameter type. And how about the supported binding? We found here all the type, a Blob storage, Azure Cosmos DB, event grid, event hub, and etc. And you found here the detail that is triggered with the input and the output. Before you use services, take a look at this table to have more idea about the connector supported and from the input and the output, and if is supported by a trigger.